I think you've all heard stories about strange neighbors, and this story is no exception. When Mr. Clark moved into the apartment above mine, I barely noticed. The building was old, creaky floors, thin walls, the whole deal. People came and went all the time. But there was something about him, right from the start, that felt off. I first saw him late one evening as I was hauling groceries through the lobby. He stood by the mailboxes, tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned gray coat, the collar turned up high. His skin was pale, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, and his eyes, sunken and glassy, barely flicked toward me when I mumbled a quick, "Hey." No smile. No nod. Just a blank stare before he returned to sorting through his mail with long, bony fingers. I chalked it up to city life. People keep to themselves. But the weirdness didn't stop there. That night, around 2 a.m., I was half asleep when I heard it, slow, heavy footsteps pacing above my bedroom. Back and forth. Back and forth. The guy had just moved in, so maybe he was unpacking, but the pattern didn't make sense. It wasn't random shifting around, it was rhythmic, methodical. Almost like he was measuring the room with his steps. It became a nightly thing. Always around 2 a.m., always the same dragging footsteps. Some nights it'd go on for an hour. Others until dawn. I mentioned it to Ms. Patel, the old lady down the hall, when we crossed paths in the laundry room. "That new guy in 4B? Clark," I said, throwing a damp towel into the dryer. "He's active at night?" She froze mid-fold, her hands trembling slightly over a pile of floral bedsheets. "Furby's been empty for months," she said, her voice low. "Ever since the flooding last winter. The landlord said it wasn't livable yet." I laughed, assuming she was just misinformed. "No, someone definitely moved in. I've seen him." But the look on her face, this tight, pinched fear, stuck with me all the way back upstairs. That night, I stayed awake, waiting. 2 a.m. came. The footsteps started. But this time, I noticed something else, something that hadn't clicked before. They weren't coming from above. They were coming from inside my apartment. I shot up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and they echoed through my apartment like the walls themselves were amplifying them. I held my breath, trying to convince myself I was wrong. Maybe the old pipes, maybe the floorboards shifting. But no, they were inside. I grabbed the closest thing I could use as a weapon, an old baseball bat leaning against my closet, and tiptoed into the dark hallway. The sound had stopped, but the air felt wrong. Thick, like I was walking through a fog I couldn't see. I flicked on the hall light. Nothing. I checked the living room. Empty. Kitchen. Empty. But when I reached the wall that bordered the stairwell, I heard it. Scratching. Slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging along the other side of the drywall. I pressed my ear against it. The scratching stopped. Then tap. 3 knocks, soft but deliberate, coming from inside the wall. I backed away fast, nearly tripping over a pile of shoes by the door. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I cornered the landlord, Frank, out front while he was hosing down the sidewalk. "Hey Frank, what's going on with 4B? Someone's living there, right?" He shook his head, cigarette dangling from his lips. "Nah, place is still gutted. Mold everywhere. No one's been up there for months." I didn't tell him about the footsteps, or the scratching. It sounded insane even in my head. But that night I did something stupid. I stayed up waiting again. 2 a.m. The footsteps returned. But this time, they didn't stop at the ceiling or the walls. They moved toward my front door. And then, knock. I froze, staring at the door like it might burst open. The knocks came again, louder. Against every survival instinct in my body, I walked over and looked through the peephole. Mr. Clark stood there, motionless. Same gray coat, same hollow eyes, but now, up close, I noticed something else. His skin wasn't just pale. It was wrong. Thin, almost translucent, with dark veins spiderwebbing beneath the surface. He raised his hand slowly and placed his palm flat against the door, right over the peephole. I stumbled back. Another knock, softer this time. Then silence. When I finally opened the door, hours later, as dawn broke, there was nothing there, except deep scratch marks on the wood. I didn't open my front door for 2 days after that. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Clark's hand pressed against the peephole. His translucent skin stretched thin over long fingers, as if he could feel me staring back. But curiosity's a nasty thing. creeps up on you, whispers in your ear until you can't ignore it. On the third day, I headed down to the basement. Frank kept old building records down there, blueprints, repair notes, stuff nobody cared about. I figured if there was something weird about 4B or the walls, maybe the blueprints would tell me. The basement was as creepy as you'd expect. Concrete walls sweating moisture, a single flickering bulb over the storage shelves. I dug through dusty files until I found the original floor plans from the 50s. First, nothing jumped out. 4 floors, 12 units, basic stuff. But then, tucked between pages, I found a hand-drawn amendment. Someone had sketched in an extra space, wedged between 4B and the stairwell. A narrow, windowless room. No door. No mention of it on the official plans. It wasn't supposed to exist. I felt my stomach twist. The scratching I'd heard, it had come from that wall. Someone or something was in there. I didn't realize how long I'd been in the basement until the bulb above me flickered hard and went out, plunging everything into darkness. That's when I heard it again. Scratching. But this time it wasn't above me or through the walls. It was right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, its weak beam slicing through the dark. Nothing. But on the dusty concrete floor, fresh drag marks trailed away from where I stood, deep grooves, like someone had clawed at the ground, pulling themselves across it. I bolted. Back upstairs, I slammed my apartment door shut and shoved the deadbolt into place, my chest heaving. Then I heard it tap from the wall behind my couch. I didn't sleep that night either. By the next morning, paranoia had fully sunk its claws into me. Every creak of the building felt intentional. Every shadow in the corner of my eye lingered too long. But the blueprints, that hidden room, I couldn't let it go. I decided to talk to Ms. Patel again. If anyone knew something about this building's history, it'd be her. She'd lived here since the 80s. I knocked on her door, and after a few tense moments, it cracked open. She blinked up at me, her silver hair pulled tight into a bun. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks. Ms. Patel, I need to ask, did anything ever happen in 4B? Or anything weird about the building?" She hesitated, her eyes darting down the hall, then motioned for me to come inside. Her apartment was warm, cluttered with houseplants and the smell of strong chai. "There's something you should know," she whispered, lowering her voice. "Years ago, back before you moved in, there was a tenant in 4B. A man named Clark." I froze. He kept to himself. No family. But late at night, people heard him talking to someone. Long conversations. Except she leaned in, he lived alone. I swallowed hard. What happened to him? Her lips thinned. One night he just vanished. Left everything behind. The landlord found scratch marks all over the walls. But the police? They didn't care. Called it a disappearance, closed the case. And the hidden room? I asked. She frowned. "What hidden room?" I showed her the blueprints I'd copied on my phone. Her face went pale. "That wasn't there before," she whispered. "That night, I made up my mind. I was going to find that room." I pried open the maintenance hatch in the 4th-floor hallway right near 4B. The passage was tight, lined with dust-caked pipes and a smell like old metal and rot. I crawled through until I reached the space marked on the blueprint. There it was. A wall that didn't belong, cheap drywall sloppily thrown up. I kicked at it until the brittle material caved in, revealing a dark, cramped room beyond. Inside, the air was cold and damp. There was only one thing in the room. A mirror. Tall, old, its ornate frame warped with age. I stepped closer, my breath fogging the glass. My reflection looked back, but something was off. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't. Then it lifted its hand and waved. I stumbled backward, but before I could run, a sharp voice echoed from behind me. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, expecting Mr. Clark, but it was Ms. Patel. Her kind face was gone. Her eyes were glassy, hollow. "Clark never left," she said, her voice distorted. "And now neither will you." I staggered backward, my shoulder hitting the cracked drywall, dust clouding the air. "Ms. Patel?" I gasped, but the words felt stupid the second they left my mouth. This wasn't her, at least not anymore. She stepped into the cramped room, her figure half lit by the weak beam from my flashlight. Her shadow stretched long, warped against the mirror. "I warned you," she said, her voice layered, like someone else was speaking through her. Then I noticed something in the mirror. She wasn't reflected. Where she should have been standing, there was only my reflection, still smiling. Its hand now pressed flat against the glass, as though trying to break through. "I didn't want this for you," she murmured, her hollow eyes softening, just for a second. "But it's hungry." Before I could speak, her body jolted, like something inside her snapped, and she lunged. I ducked instinctively, her hands clawing through the air above me. My flashlight slipped from my grip, skittering across the floor, its beam now landing directly on the mirror. That's when I saw him, Mr. Clark. He stood on the other side of the glass, his hands flat against it, face twisted in panic. Not the hollow-eyed specter I'd seen before. He was trapped, his mouth forming silent words. "Help me." Miss Patel let out a guttural sound, her body twitching violently, as if fighting something inside her. I scrambled for the flashlight, my hand brushing the cold metal. In one wild swing, I smashed it into the mirror. Glass shattered outward in slow motion, shards catching the weak light like frozen raindrops. The room imploded with a rush of cold air, the force slamming me backward. When I opened my eyes, I was alone. The mirror was gone. So was Miss Patel. And in the dust on the floor, where the mirror once stood, was a single handprint, smudged and deep, like someone had been clawing their way out. I barely made it back to my apartment. But the worst part? When I passed Miss Patel's door, it was wide open. Her apartment was empty, plants withered, no smell of chai, like she'd never lived there at all. That night, as I finally collapsed into bed, the silence felt heavy, but I told myself it was over, until 2 a.m., when I heard footsteps. But this time they weren't above me. They were in my hallway, and then tap, right on my bedroom door. The tapping was slow, patient, like whoever or whatever was on the other side knew I was awake. I lay frozen, the thin blanket pulled up to my chin like that would somehow protect me. Tap. This wasn't like before. This time, the sound wasn't muffled through walls or warped by old pipes. It was sharp, direct. The doorknob rattled. I couldn't stop my hand from trembling as I reached for the baseball bat I'd left by the bed. Another knock. I forced myself to move, creeping out of bed, each step heavy and silent on the wooden floor. I pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. Then, a whisper right against the keyhole. "Let me in." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the bat. The air in the room shifted, cold, heavy, and I could hear it now, breathing on the other side of the door. Slow, rasping breaths. I should have run. Called someone. Anything. But curiosity? It's a curse. I reached for the knob. My fingers barely brushed the cold metal before the door swung open on its own. The hallway was empty, but the lights flickered, and at the far end of the hall, near my front door, there was a trail of wet footprints, bare, human, leading away from me. I followed them, my heart pounding in my ears. The trail led to my front door, where the wood was split and warped, the same deep scratch marks clawed into it as before. But there was something else now. A note taped crookedly to the doorframe. "You let him out." The pen strokes were jagged, frantic. I barely had time to process it when I heard it faint, almost hidden beneath the buzz of the hallway lights. Footsteps. Above me. Mr. Clark, or whatever he'd become, was back. But this time he wasn't pacing in circles. He was moving toward the stairwell. Coming down. The footsteps above grew heavier, faster, no longer that slow, measured pace I'd heard night after night. They were frantic. I backed into my apartment, clutching the bat tighter, but then something strange happened. The footsteps didn't come down the stairs. They stopped, right above me. I stared up at the ceiling, my mind racing, when a loud crack split the air. The light fixture above me shattered, glass raining down as a section of the ceiling buckled inward, dust and debris filling the room. But nothing fell through. Instead, dangling through the crack was a piece of rope, old, frayed, its fibers soaked in something dark. It swung gently, like someone had just let go of it. Then I noticed it wasn't a rope. It was a noose. Before I could process that horror, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. Unknown caller. Against all common sense, I answered. "Hello?" A strained, ragged voice came through. "You're not supposed to be there." My throat went dry. Who is this? But the voice ignored me. "It's not your apartment." Static crackled, then the call dropped. I stood there, breathing hard, when my eye caught something strange. The family photos on my wall, my parents, my sister, were gone. In their place were black and white portraits of people I didn't recognize. The couch? Not the one I'd bought last year. The chipped coffee table I'd been meaning to replace? Gone. My apartment wasn't mine anymore. I stumbled to the front door and yanked it open. The hallway stretched out longer than it ever had before, doors I didn't recognize lining the walls, none of them marked with numbers. That's when I realized I hadn't let Clark out. I'd let myself in, into his world. And somewhere in the distance I could hear it again. Tap. But this time it was coming from inside the walls. The tapping grew louder, sharper now, almost urgent, as if whatever was behind the walls knew I was finally listening. I slammed the front door shut and pressed my back against it, my mind racing. The hallway outside had stretched into something wrong. Endless. And my apartment, if that's what it still was, felt unfamiliar in the worst way. The air was heavier now, carrying a faint, metallic smell like rust or blood. The tapping shifted again. Now it was scratching. From the wall right behind me. I turned slowly, my breath fogging in the cold air. There, in the wallpaper where there hadn't been anything before, thin cracks spiderwebbed out as though something inside was pressing against it. I raised the baseball bat, my hands slick with sweat. But before I could swing, a soft voice from inside the wall. "Help me." It wasn't Clark's voice. It was mine. I staggered backward, the bat clattering to the floor. "Help me," the voice repeated, closer now, strained, like it was struggling to speak through layers of drywall. My head throbbed, a sharp, pulsing pain behind my eyes, and in a rush of half-memories, it all came flooding in. The mirror. The reflection waving back. The moment it shattered. Had I ever really left that room? The wall cracked deeper. A hand shot through, gray, skeletal fingers clawing at the air. But it wasn't reaching for me. It was pulling something back in. I saw my own face in the dusty reflection of the broken light fixture, my features distorted, stretched, my eyes hollow. I wasn't the one outside the wall. I was the one inside. I was the thing scratching. Suddenly, the apartment began to collapse in on itself, walls folding, windows vanishing, as if reality was folding like paper. I reached for the hole in the wall, grabbing the skeletal hand, gripping it tight. "Pull me out!" I screamed. But the hand gripped tighter, nails digging into my wrist. "You let me out first," it whispered. And then it yanked. Everything went black. I woke up in darkness. Thick, suffocating, solid darkness. The air was damp, heavy with dust and something older, like rot and rusted metal. I couldn't move much. The space around me was too tight. Wooden beams pressed against my shoulders, and somewhere nearby, water dripped slowly, the sound echoing through the narrow void. I reached out blindly, my fingers scraping against rough drywall on one side and cold, damp concrete on the other. I was inside the walls. Panic clawed at my throat. I shoved against the wooden beams, kicking hard, but the space wouldn't give. Then, scratch, from deeper inside the walls. I froze, my breath shallow. The sound wasn't random, it was rhythmic, intentional, like someone knew something was moving toward me. Then a voice, low and ragged, echoed through the hollow space. "You took my place, Mr. Clark." His voice was closer now, seeping through the darkness like smoke. I scrambled forward, my hands scraping against splinters and rusted nails as I crawled through the narrow crawl space, ignoring the sharp sting of cuts. But the scratching followed, faster now. I crawled harder, my heart a drumbeat in my ears, until I hit something, metal, cold, and flat. A hatch. I fumbled for a handle, found a rusted latch, and yanked hard. It groaned open, stale air rushing out. I tumbled through the hatch and hit solid ground. Wooden floorboards warped and dusty. When I stood up, I realized where I was. The hidden room. The mirror, shattered before, was whole again, standing tall in its warped frame. But it didn't reflect me. Instead, I saw my apartment. Pristine. Normal. And there I was, sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone like none of this had ever happened. But something was off. My reflection looked up, straight at me, and it smiled. "I told you," Clark's voice rasped behind me. I turned. He stood there, but not as I'd seen him before. Not the hollow-eyed skeletal thing. He looked alive, normal. "You let me out," he said softly. "Now it's your turn to stay." He raised his hand, and the walls around me shuddered, cracks racing up the mirror. I lunged at the glass, my fist smashing through and everything fractured. The sound of splintering glass swallowed me whole. I crashed through the glass, cold shards slicing across my arms and face, and for a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no air, just the sensation of falling through something thick and heavy, like sinking in black water. Then I hit the floor, hard. The air in my lungs exploded out in a gasp as I scrambled to my feet. I was back in my apartment, the real one. The peeling wallpaper, the dented coffee table, the dying plant by the window. All of it exactly as I remembered. But it was quiet. No footsteps. No tapping. I stumbled to the window. The street below buzzed with life. Cars, people, normalcy. It was over, or so I thought. I turned toward the mirror that still hung in my hallway. For a moment, my reflection just stared back at me. Normal. But then it blinked out of sync with me. A slow, deliberate blink. Then it smiled. That same hollow, too-wide smile Clark had worn. I backed away, my mouth dry. "You made it out," my reflection said, its voice muffled, like it was coming from behind thick glass. I shook my head. "No, this is my apartment. I'm back." The reflection tilted its head. "You think you crawled out?" it asked, voice soft, almost pitying. "You didn't leave. You just switched places." My stomach twisted. I turned to look at the room again, and that's when I noticed the subtle changes, small but wrong. The crack in the corner of the ceiling was missing. The scuff marks on the floor by the fridge gone. Even the faint smell of coffee I usually left in the air? Nothing. This wasn't my apartment. I turned back to the mirror in a panic, but my reflection was gone. In its place was another man. His face pale, his mouth open in a silent scream as he banged his fists against the other side of the glass. It was Clark, still trapped, but not in the walls, in the mirror, and that's when I felt it, an itch deep in my palms. I looked down. My skin was growing thin, almost translucent. Blue veins spiderwebbed up my arms. The same way Clark had looked. I wasn't out. I was next, and somewhere, beyond the walls, I heard it tap. But this time it wasn't asking to come in. It was asking to get out.